creating a model that actually is linked to temperature, that kind of defeats the purpose, though. As what Ottmar Edenhofer said, it's climate policy is about redistributing the world's wealth. How's that going to be achieved if you actually try to create something that's coming up the works? Anyway, we at this point have come to the time where we will accept questions from the audience. Do we have a microphone? Yes, we do. So we'll let them pick it out. And please tell us who you are and address your question to one of our panelists.
I am Francis Menton of the Manhattan Contrarian website. I can't believe that all three of you seem to take this social cost of carbon thing seriously and then tweak it here and there. Isn't warm better? Doesn't carbon dioxide fertilize? Isn't this whole thing total bullshit? Please comment.
Any takers?
No. It's not all bullshit. We're pretty clear that if the climate warms, some parts of the world will get better. Canada's going to do much better. Okay, Canada's going to do much better if it turns out that the climate warms. But if you're already near the equator, you already are in part of the planet that's very hot, and any increase in temperature there is going to cause damages. So even today, if climate changes, it's pretty obvious that warming has potential damages associated with it. Now, it's also true that CO2 is beneficial.
When they don't have it?
Say that again?
More than getting electricity when they don't have it, which they don't at the equator?
Well, the question is, if there's damages associated with warming, does that mean we'll have no electricity? Those two things don't mean one another. It turns out if you think there are small damages associated with climate change, you try to opt for less carbon-intensive electricity. It doesn't mean you opt for no electricity.
Kevin or Ross, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just picking up on that point. I mentioned at the beginning the social cost of carbon. I would prefer to use the marginal damages of CO2 emissions, but that takes too long. The SCC, it's never a number you use on its own. So using the example of the third world and electricity, I think it's terrible that the World Bank tried to stop funding for the Medupi power plant in southern Africa on the grounds that it would release CO2 emissions. They need the electricity, and any reasonable cost-benefit analysis would show that building that power plant and expanding their power production facilities would yield benefits vastly outweighing anything that we might associate with the CO2 emissions. So I think your concern there is that people misuse the concepts, or they try to say that social cost of carbon is a positive number, therefore we shouldn't build power plants. And I mean, that's just faulty logic. Taking the concept seriously, there's some things that you can take seriously as a concept, even though you know that you'll never really be able to put a precise number to it. And but it still helps clarify your thinking on the issue, and that's how I approach this.
Well, I was just going to point out that under one of the three models, the SCC can actually be negative, suggesting that carbon dioxide emissions are actually a good thing for the planet. The policy implication there would be that one shouldn't be taxing carbon dioxide emissions, but subsidizing it instead. So, yeah.
And I think it's important to note that by them engaging, I mean, that is where the debate is in many, having gone to UN meetings, gone to other places, that this is where the debate's at. So having experts that can talk the language, look at the models and answer them is extremely helpful, even if it, in many cases, may be garbage, according to many of us. Nick?
Yeah. I get to go? Okay. I was going to ask the question, what would you guys do if, in fact, there was now scientific proof that there was absolutely no impact of carbon dioxide on warming? That was going to be my question. And last session, there was actually some discussion that there's not that much research dollars that goes into the climate, the other end of climate. It's only the warming end. I happen to have I'm an independent science researcher myself, Carl Zeller and Ned Nikoloff. I do have a handout to give you, and we do have, it's brand new. It avoids all the modelings that's been done radiatively. This has an entirely different phenomenal look at climate change, and I can tell you, there is no impact of carbon dioxide, so all three of you are wasting your time. Come work for me.
All right, I don't know as though that was a question, but,
Well,
wait, who has the microphone here?
I can answer that a little bit.
Oh, you want to try to? okay.
Yeah, what would they do? What would you do if all of a sudden, in fact, I'm saying this is real, and what if it was?
Yeah, okay.
I
so
know it is.
We do know that carbon dioxide is beneficial to plants, that if plants had to vote for this, they'd vote for more greenhouse gases, more CO2 in the atmosphere, because they will, in fact, that's helpful to their growth. They'll grow faster and they'll prosper. So if there was no warming consequence, we would look at the CO2 benefits associated with that. You'd also still have acidification of the oceans, which is going to be harmful eventually to wildlife in the oceans. That would slow you down a little bit, but I think probably the benefits on terrestrial ecosystems is so great that you would get more CO2 in the atmosphere. You'd vote for it. You subsidize it.
I showed you what I would do, which if it turns out you're right, what it would mean is basically you end up with no policy into the perpetual future. But I wouldn't want to put a policy in place that on the basis of the assumption that I know what the future is going to be for the climate, or that is somehow contingent on my opinion about the science. And so the mechanism I propose, it doesn't actually depend in any way on my view of the science or any one individual's view. And hopefully it would sound like your expectation, because then that would avoid a lot of problems.
All right. We have another question?
Coalition.
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, my name is Mark Carr, and I help the CO2 Coalition from time to time. Kevin, on your point about not being able to use a model because of the co-authorship and things like that, isn't there like a fair use type of parallel in the work that you do that allows you to run the person's model, acknowledging that it's their creative work, but like, hey, we're critiquing this by running it. We're not playing along with authorship and the capacity to reject the publication. Is there no fair use type of thing in your universe there?
I'm sorry, so I guess I don't understand the question. Regarding the three models,
And the one you didn't run because you couldn't give an honest appraisal without the guy's permission.
Well, the thing is, he wouldn't give us the codes. So regarding the three models, I contacted the EPA for the computer codes, and they gave me the DICE codes. The fun model codes you can download from github.com, and then they give some specific instructions to modify them to replicate their results. For the page model, they give us some instructions, but they also say you have to contact Chris Hope for the codes, and he refused to give them to us unless we allowed him to be a co-author on anything we published.
All right. We have another question?
Well, first of all, just one statement. Who decides how much is taxed and who gets the money on a global basis, which seems to me is unsolvable. But more importantly, what about attribution? My name is Steve Hines, I'm sorry, the word merchant. Shouldn't we be giving, as far as attribution, the countries that are emitting the most get the largest tax so that they, in fact, reduce their consumption or their emission?
No, well, the country that has the largest emissions, since they'd have the largest tax base, so they'd be paying the most in that sense. But not necessarily would they have the largest tax rate, because it depends on the marginal cost of public funds in their country. So if everyone paid the same tax rate, then yeah, the country with the most emissions pays the most in taxes.
Leo Goldstein from DeFi-CCC-12. A question to Robert Mendelsohn. What's so wrong with Yale University? Why in the 30s it was on the forefront of eugenics? Now it is on the forefront of climate alarmism. So what's so wrong with it? Thank you.
It's the leading university in philosophy. That's what's wrong.
That says it all. All right, next is, again, identify yourself, please.
I'm Dave Burton, and I have a website called sealevel.info. I have a question for Dr. McKitrick. That's a really interesting proposal you had there, but an objection comes to mind, and perhaps you'll address it. It seems that people tend to find what they're looking for, and there's a strong incentive already amongst most of the climate science community to find more warming. It seems like your system would attach a lot of dollar movement to the published estimates of temperature, and you already, if you look at these different temperature indices, they vary pretty substantially. And if we put incentives in place for those things to go one way or another, depending on it seems like a problem. Seems like a potential unintended side effect. And I don't know what you would do about that. I mean, it comes to mind, maybe you should index to sea level instead, sea level rise instead of temperature, because the tide gauge numbers are a lot more trustworthy, I think, than the temperature numbers. But people combine those tide gauge numbers and come up with indices that are also quite questionable, and they use worse stuff with satellites. So
Yeah.
you got a way to address that concern.
So first of all, Dave, thank you for sealevel.info. If the rest of you don't know about it, it's a fantastic website, and you should take a look. Yeah, the temperature index has to be objective, non-manipulable. I would suggest it should be based on satellite readings. Just avoid all the crap with the surface temperature adjustments. I don't think there's any saving the surface temperature network. I've published lots of papers using that data, and it's just, you never hit bottom as far as what the real numbers are. I think it's possible, though, on a going forward basis to improve the satellite system so we don't have these gaps in the record when one satellite goes out and another one comes in. That's where the disagreements are about how to calibrate and splice the series together. So if you had redundant satellites, so we don't have these calibration problems, then you could have an objective, non-manipulable series measuring the part of the atmosphere that we're actually interested in. That's how I would resolve that problem.
Okay. This will be the last question back here.
Bill Lindquist is my name. If during the years and decades ahead the globe could conceivably cool, not warm, could you experts there on the panel justify coming up with a negative cost of carbon so that I'm encouraged and paid to pump out every incremental ton of CO2 that I could manage?
Actually, yes, I'm actually very concerned in the long run that the planet's going to cool, because the average temperature on the Earth is about 5 degrees colder than today. And frankly, a world that's 5 degrees colder than today would be very unpleasant for a place like the United States. So in the very long run, you get out of this little 20,000 year warming period we're in, we're going to face much colder temperatures. And I think those are going to be just as dangerous, just as risky as going to very high temperatures. Now, exactly how you'd actually do that, whether you want to hold on to your CO2 and wait till it gets colder and use it then, or whether you want to spend it now and just hope it sits up there in the atmosphere for a long time, that I'm not sure I know the science of that. But that's in the long run, actually, cooling is in our future. And that's a danger that we're going to face.
Yeah. So these models, in principle, if you had an equilibrium climate sensitivity distribution under such a scenario, you could put that into these models to determine that, and you would get probably a negative social cost of carbon. Even under the ECS distributions that are more up to date, you get that. But then the bottom line is, even if there is a negative SCC, I'm not sure anybody would be wanting regulators and bureaucrats to be telling them how to pump CO2 into the atmosphere, right?
Yes, 5 degrees cooler, that would be like living in Canada. That would be terrible. Well, thank you for being here at our panel, and appreciate you. Give a round of applause for our panelists, and thank you for coming.